My systems journey probably most formally started in around 2012 when I was at Qatar Petroleum and I met a wonderful person called Petros Panakanithos from Software AG. And he asked me two questions. He said, do you know what requisite variety is? And do you know who Michael Jackson is, not the singer? Social systems are different. The parts, special parts, people, I don't like to call it parts or resources, we have choice. We have purpose. At best, we have an org chart, which is nothing more than a blame chart. All improvement requires change, but not all change is improvement. So I'm a big believer in people. I'm a big believer that the world has finite physical resources, but human development, human potential is infinite. Whilst you can't develop someone directly, we can create conditions that allow us to develop and flourish. Let's just remind ourselves that human beings are generalists. We specialize in generalizing, right? We were never meant to just do one thing.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cyberson Labs podcast, where we explore multidisciplinary insights that help improve the effectiveness of tech executives, practitioners, and entrepreneurs. Today, we have a special guest, Abdul Aziz. Abdul is someone who's deeply passionate about business improvement and, more importantly, human development. He is the inventor of Viable Operating Model. We met each other through LinkedIn first, and then I actually met him in flesh and blood at the Systems Thinking, Systems Practice conference early this year at the University of Hull. He has some of the nuanced, insightful takes on LinkedIn. If you're not following him, please do follow him and also subscribe to his Substack. He's the one who I would go to if I want to have a chat about systems thinking, cybernetics, complexity in an organizational context. That's what this podcast is going to be all about. Abdul, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Alex. It's really good to be here. And it's, really glad that we're getting a chance to speak. And it was an absolute pleasure to have met you in the flesh. I guess I might say one thing. So whilst I love systems thinking and all the tools and whatnot, I don't want us to ever mistake the finger for the moon. The whole point is to improve the business. And I'm quite happy to drop the language and the tools once we've got ourselves to a better place.
Awesome. Abdul, I want to start with your journey first, because I think that's very, very intriguing. Like, one of the common things that connects the guests of this podcast is they are practitioners who take their theory very seriously. And I really see that in your work. And you also kind of have a very diverse set of work experiences across the globe. And I'm curious to learn more about your journey and how you came across systems thinking, cybernetics, complexity, how that weaves into your own story. Say more about that.
Sure. I'll try my best, and I'll try not to go into a monologue as well. So I grew up in Sheffield, which is in Yorkshire, for those familiar with the region. So we usually say things as they are. I guess I could say my career has been 25 odd years to date. I have essentially a numerate type background, so maths and physics for A levels, and then computer science and mathematics as an undergraduate degree. My systems journey probably most formally started in around 2012 when I was at Qatar Petroleum, and I met a wonderful person called Petros Panakanithos from Software AG, and he asked me two questions. He said, do you know what requisite variety is, and do you know who Michael Jackson is, not the singer? Of course, I wasn't sure on either count. So it kind of formally started there, and it was right at the deep end. Petros had devised a critical systems thinking approach to improving information systems, business systems, purpose analysis. And we ran a program there for a couple of years in a large oil and gas business, like I said. So I was right in at the deep end. In terms of kind of just going back, peeling back a little bit, I started my career in UK defence, working on tactical network design systems, on Link 16 systems. Actually, there's a funny story. Roger James, who I've met recently, said, your systems journey is shaped by what you were doing between the ages of 18 and 22. So what I was doing at that stage was an undergraduate degree in maths and computing, and then writing tools to create a graphical user interface for different military platforms to communicate with each other. I won't share the rest of the conversation. I think it was private. So yes, I think my appreciation, if I had to broadly describe my career, it was kind of it's very much about technology, and then I became a process person, and then I became a systems person. In the end, I've realized I'm a people person, and I've also kind of realized that stack, that socio-technological stack, is actually circular. It closes in on itself. So that's generally been the story of my career. Half of it has been within the IT organization, half of it has been outside the IT organization. It's, like I said, numerous industries, defense I've mentioned, but healthcare, financial services, oil and gas, most recently construction. And I've had various kind of job titles, from being an information engineer to a systems engineer to an enterprise architect. And I know that term ruffles a few feathers, but my interpretation of enterprise architecture is quite different from the contemporary understanding. What else can I say? I think it's also very important to talk about contemporary organizations and what they're about. I'm okay with organizations seeking profit, seeking EBITDA, regulatory compliance. These are things that managers think are important, and I don't think we can shy away from that. We just have to maybe frame things a little bit better. So yeah, that's kind of my career today. I operate as an independent consultant through Requisite Variety Solutions. I'm also a associate with Endava as well. So as well as developing the viable operating model through practice, I need to make a living as well. And I'm kind of, as I mentioned to you previously, potentially starting some doctoral studies and writing some material which may or may not become a set of books.
Awesome. I look forward to all of that. You mentioned you finally realized that you were a people person. And so that really kind of leads me to my next question. I'm curious about your worldview, the lens that you use to view people in an organizational setting. I ask this question because the typical Silicon Valley executive's mindset is people are like cogs in a machine that can be easily replaced. Oh, if I can't meet the profit margin for next quarter, I can just lay off 5% of my people and then meet the profit for next quarter. I know you said I'm okay with, companies seeking profit, but probably I think the nuance is if that becomes the only purpose of the company versus actually, building something of value for customers. But anyway, I don't want to digress there, but I want to understand, how do you view people? What is their, fundamental human nature? Like some examples from the past, obviously, is like theory X versus theory Y, McGregor's ideas. And kind of what lens do you use when you view an organization?
Okay, definitely a people person, but not a person pleaser, if that makes sense. A bit like Marmite, if that translates across the Atlantic. Look, besides Petros, I've also had some other wonderful mentors, both within organizations and kind of just generally from the systems community as well. And I'll mention a few of those people because it's a way of me acknowledging and thanking the support and time that they've given me throughout my career.
Sure.
I think the first thing to point out is I love Heinz von Forster's statement that humans are non-trivial machines. Yeah. Okay, we'll always surprise you. And if we kind of go back to Kant, and the categorical imperative, we should never treat people as a means to an end. Okay, and that's a really important part of the viable operating model. And if we recall why we ever established corporate organizations in the first place, well, the organizations were really meant to be a tool for us And I think we've got that balance a bit wrong. And that's one of the key pillars of the viable operating model we could hopefully talk about.
Yeah.
So I'm a big ascriber of Churchman's idea of, organizations are voluntary associations of purposeful people going about doing something that they can't. You mentioned theory X and theory Y and kind of hygiene factors and all that good stuff. And for my sins, and it actually was a blessing, if I'm being honest. I did an MBA too, kind of 10 years into my career. I really did enjoy the MBA, and a lot of people give MBAs a stick. But so whilst those theories are helpful, I think they're also kind of reductive. Like I said, people will always surprise you, and it's not simple enough to say, you like work or you dislike work. I think it's really important practically to kind of understand. There's another 2x2 matrix, I can't name it, where you understand or you appreciate someone's competence and their commitment to work and the combinations of that. So the way we may encourage someone who's highly competent and highly committed would be different from the way we would, encourage someone from the other extreme. And that's my sense of being fair with those around us. So I'm a big believer that, if we all go back to Ackoff and, we can treat organizations as machines, as organisms and as social systems, and each of them are different in the sense that a machine, neither the parts nor the whole have choice. In an organism, that our organs don't have choice unless something's drastically wrong with us, but we do as a whole. Social systems are different. The parts, the special parts, people, I don't like to call us parts or resources, we have choice, we have purpose, and the organization itself has purpose. So I think these are three really powerful lenses.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of our woes and problems come from the mismatch between the model and the system. So I'm a big believer in people. I'm a big believer that the world has finite physical resources, but human development, human potential is infinite. And it's the network effect. So, whilst you can't develop someone directly, we can create conditions that allow us to develop and flourish. And we have to take responsibility for that ourselves.
Awesome. Those are great messages. In one of your recent posts, you talked about how, before you study Zen, mountains are just mountains. And while you study it, they stop being mountains. But after you study it, after enlightenment, mountains are mountains again. And using that metaphor, you said a simple rule of thumb that helps you kind of navigate that stage 2 is that epistemology comes first, and systems are epistemological and not ontological. I happen to agree with that position. So can you say more about that specific point? Because I think we should get that out first before we actually even go and talk about your viable operating model. Because in the comments, I actually called out that, hey, that's an intellectual imperative for anyone who proposes a new framework, is they should talk about their epistemology before they tell you what your ontology is or how to even classify them as simple, complicated, or complex.
Sure. I'll share a brief story, actually. I remember sharing the mountain story with someone at work once. I was in an engineering business, and it was their first day, and I shared that story. And we spoke about enterprise architecture, about being the relationships between the things, not the things themselves, and thingness versus relationshipness. And they remarked that they shared that story on a group that they were part of, and it made them think or chuckle or some combination of that. And it made me think, hang on, was that the right thing to say when I met someone for the very first time? Because of course we can take things literally. I think there's an important point about being serious but not taking yourself too seriously as we think about that story. Look, I learned philosophy much later in life. I didn't see, look, I studied maths and I did formulas and I wrote code, and um, I wasn't the greatest reader in the world. So philosophy and all those things came late to me in life. So understanding what ontology and epistemology and all that good stuff was came much later. But I do agree with you. It's important to share how we position ourselves in the world. Again, I take Kant's view that, we can't know the world in and of itself. We have, we see phenomena, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
We can talk about kind of Bhaskara's ideas and all that good stuff as well. My thought is, look, there is a real world out there, but we must have humility in our epistemology, and we must have phenomenological awareness as well. I don't know what the ordering should be, so for me it's triangulating, I guess. But I'm sure that if you assume that it's always ontology first, you can get into a lot of trouble. So Jeff Elliott's advice, and he knows a little bit about systems thinking, is, as a rule of thumb, epistemology first, and that works for me. It works for me because a lot. So even the viable systems model, I think people misunderstand it as being an ontological model. And it isn't, because it's based on Ashby's ideas of selecting variables, and their relationships and seeing what worked. It's like driving a car. You don't have to create a model of the black box, the engine. You just have to create a model of your relationship with the dials and the levers, or the steering wheel and the gear stick. And that's what you need a working model of. It's about being aware of what your positioning is, and it's about sharing that with others as well, so you can have a more meaningful conversation, for me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not that we're rejecting that there exists an external reality, but as informationally closed beings, we truly lack access to the external reality. And if that is the case, I think that epistemically humble position to take is that thumb rule, which is epistemology comes first, and then you go and talk. Of course, separating them doesn't make sense as well, because it's an interaction that's going between you and your environment as well.
So the world pushes back, but equally, our thinking should also push back as well. So that kind of friction can happen in two senses, and that's really important to appreciate. I'm also, if we kind of consider what modern cognitive science is about, it's the idea that we create a web of beliefs, of ideas that keep themselves in check, in friction, to allow us to act purposefully. We don't need to find bedrock. And the brief story I'll share there, if you don't mind, is I remember being in Dubai and seeing the Burj Khalifa, and then speaking to some engineers and asking, just marveling as how did it keep the structure up? And they spoke about friction piles. This whole thing is kept up with having suitable friction. And I think that's a very useful analogy for how we move through in life. It's turtles all the way down, and it's infinite regress. So I don't need to solve that wider problem. I just need enough ideas and concepts and feedback to allow me to act purposefully and move forward. And the idea of relativism and the opposite being imperialism is, I think I'm inspired here by Maturana and Varela's idea of all knowing is doing, which essentially means that we are structurally coupled to the world. We're roughly 100 billion neurons, and we live in our own worlds, but we get perturbed by the world, and we form a certain relationship and a set of histories. So it explains a lot for me. It means that the world isn't relative, but at the same time we live in different worlds, and we can update those models, and it allows me to make sense of, well, hang on, the world, when it's not deterministic. We're not the victims of determinism, but equally we don't have absolute free will. It's something in between, and that's structural determinism. That's why when you hear a certain word, it has little or no impact to you, and when I hear that word, it might trigger me, or it might excite me, or make me happy.
Absolutely.
And I think that allows us to get away from relativism and imperialism, and appreciate that actually, and that statement I made there, all knowing is doing, also collapses something else, which is this false dichotomy between theory and practice. So, and that's an important point I learned from my mentor, John Beckford, who I also met at the same time as I met Petros. So when I was at QP, just to kind of share that story a little bit. So Petros was like, what requisite varieties? And I said, I just know about Heinz variety 57. And he said, not that. And I said to myself, okay, the other statement he made is, Abdul, you're a smart guy, you understand your engineering and software engineering in my case, but you just don't understand the psychology and the sociology of the situation, which really bothered me.
Yeah.
I'm still not sure that I do, but I'm certainly trying. But one of the things I did was reach out to different people who understood systems thinking, the viable system model, and that's when I met John Beckford. One of the things he first shared with me, and I think one of his papers was just incredible, the idea of theory and practice being a virtuous cycle, theory in practice and practice in theory. These are just different ways of organizing knowledge. And I think that's a powerful statement.
Yes.
Well.
Yes. I'm a big fan of Kurt Lewin, the practical theorist. And also the other thing that comes to mind is Heinz von Foester's, if you want to see, learn how to act.
Yes.
Awesome. This actually leads me, the way you answer that question leads me to another question of mine, which is how you actually connect the dots. And there is a specific post that comes to mind. I think we'll link that out in the newsletter that goes out with the podcast. And you really connect the dots between the various authors and their ideas in completely different domains. Really remarkable. I think that's a great example of how you should actually learn in the age of AI, because just deep expertise in just one domain is not enough. You gotta actually be able to read from different domains and actually synthesize between the domains, which is amazing when I see you do that. So I'm kind of curious, what are some of the books, talks, papers, or authors that profoundly influenced you in your journey and when you came up with the viable operating model?
It's hard to say. In some respects, everyone and everything. The idea is to read widely, but the idea is also to act and try and do things and build things, whether that's a software product or something a bit more physical. So I'm a big believer in kind of trying different things. Interesting story. So when I worked in an engineering business, one of the things that I realized very quickly is if you give a software engineer a certain problem or a situation, by default, they will try and solve it with code. If you give the same situation to a mechanical engineer or an electrical engineer, they'll try and solve it with a circuit board or some physical device. Yeah. So I'm a big believer in reading widely. I'm going to misquote this, but the idea is, look, God doesn't know or care for the difference between physics and science and biology and sociology. These are distinctions that we've made, for lack of a better word. So read widely, and maybe in some respects I'm making up for my very limited reading when I was young. I mean, I will share a brief story. I wasn't that bad. I was actually in my school, I was actually a librarian. But none of my friends knew I was a librarian because they'd never visit the library. So I'd play football and then I'd be in the library during my lunch breaks and whatnot. Unfortunately, most of the books I read were kind of fiction and or rather kind of limited to one genre. Some of the books that have inspired me, look, I can say kind of Stafford Beer's stuff. I pretty much read most of his stuff lots of times, and that's because I never understood it in the first place. So I'm still trying to understand it. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. But Stafford's ideas are, it's the gift that keeps giving so much nuance to it. I think you made the point about nuance to me. One of the authors I do really like is his name is Garudagagi. I can't pronounce it right. Something like that. He was a contemporary or a friend of Ackoff's, and he wrote a wonderful book called Systems Thinking, kind of a managed approach to business architecture. And one of the statements he made in that book was really powerful. It helped me greatly to think about what design meant. And he asked, what's the difference between science and art? And he said, science is about seeing similarity and difference. It's about finding invariance. Art is about finding difference and similarity. So science is about seeing, somebody's talking about the cosmos and somebody's talking about a cell. What's the invariant feature there? Whereas art is about saying, well, hang on, we've got a pair of twins here, but what's the difference? And then he described design as being creating purposeful wholes from infeasible parts. So that's the relationship between science, art, and design. And of course, it makes you realize that you can't separate one from the other. Systems thinking and reductive thinking, for lack of a better word, are one and the same thing. We need both. We need diagnosis and we need analysis, and we need to build stuff. And sometimes we lose sight of that. And maybe we can talk a bit about that when it comes to actual organizations that are trying to improve EBITDA, that are trying to be compliant. How do we ensure that we do the diagnosis and that divergent work and that pluralistic and critical work, but at the same time we still land something, we implement a system, but then be mindful that that system isn't then regressing back to unitary thinking? How do we keep the pluralism going? And the term I use there is, I think that it'll be like something like perpetual pluralism.
I love it.
Just enough to kind of make sure that we have that little bit of conscious saying, look, have you thought about what they think, or have you thought about the assumptions that they might have? But then but not keeping all options open and inducing anxiety, for lack of a better word. So, Gada Dagaji, Beer, I've mentioned Capra. Capra's work, the web of what's it called now? Systems View of Life. That's an incredible book. Churchman, The Systems Approach is a wonderful book as well. John Beckford's got a really great book called An Intelligent Organization, but he's got a book before that called Quality, a Systems Approach, and that's a wonderful book because it really helps you to think about things like quality in a completely different way, in a much more systemic and practical way. Patrick Hoofstad's got a wonderful set of books as well. Actually, there's another really good one. Reynolds and Holwell's, I think it's called A Systems View of Change, or Systems Approach to Managing Change.
Interesting.
That's a really good book. I think they've got 5 different systems tools in there. It's like VSM, CSH, SSM, SODA, and something else. And that's a really good practical hands-on book for people working in improvement.
Awesome. There are quite a few books that I have not read, so thank you for sharing that. I will go follow up.
No worries.
So Abdul, now I want to pivot and talk about organizations and kind of how we got to now, the status quo of mainstream management. And, kind of keep in mind that a lot of my questions come from Silicon Valley, where I live in, and the corporations that I know and interact with. And so the first thing I want to understand is, what do you think is fundamentally broken in mainstream management?
Okay. So let's go back to the question of organization. So more or less, organizations are the dominant institutions of our lives. The multinational, the transnational corporation, for lack of a better word. I think we could have historically argued that it was the church or religious institutes, and then nation states, and now organizations. I wrote a short piece on how it could potentially be agents and AI in the future. I'm not so sure about it, but the dominant institutions of our lives are organizations. They're the places that we work in. They're the places that we buy our products and services from. They're the places that we invest in. And then we ask ourselves, well, this thing called management, what is it? And if we think about traditional management, it's the old Polk view, right? Planning, organization, leading, controlling, those things. And it's an okay model, but it's a very myopic model of what management is. I think it's Friedman Malik who's made a statement that I think he defined management as the transformation of knowledge to value, and he described it as the most important societal function. And he's absolutely right. Managers have immense responsibility, and I don't want it to make it into like a history lesson, but the idea of the principal agent problem and all that good stuff. How do we ensure managers? What is a manager's fiduciary responsibility? Is it to the shareholder only, or is it to the stakeholders? And we can talk all about that good stuff. But the manager, the role of the manager is an important role. And let's kind of speak a bit more cybernetically. Every manager is a cybernetician. They're a helmsman or a regulator, even if they don't know it. And that idea of regulation is about steering your boat, your steamboat, towards a certain goal, a target, but appreciating that currents and the wind might move you into a different direction. And that's just the essence of cybernetics. But actually, if you take that into a second order cybernetic sense, it's more than that. You're not just navigating the boat towards a certain direction, you're changing the structure of the boat itself.
Yes.
And you're riding along on the drift. So management is really about transforming knowledge into value, not resources. And there we can at some point, and maybe not today, talk about the difference between the resource-based view of the world and the firm and the knowledge-based view of the firm, which goes really well with the idea of human development, which I said, is an important part of the viable operating model. So yes, there's lots wrong with the world. There's lots good about the world as well. And I think there's lots we can do to change the way we think about management. I mean, Stafford described managerial cybernetics as the art of effective organization, and cybernetics.
I think you called it the
is
science.
Defined as the science. Okay, maybe we could add the science and the art of effective organization, because I don't think it's wholly science.
Yes. In terms of how a Silicon Valley corporation is managed, did we lose our path some way? Like how we got to now? What are some of the contributing factors as to why this type of a reductionist command and control, a lot of short-termism, if I may add, persists in mainstream management today? What keeps that loop going?
I think a lot of it comes from, the idea of Adam Smith and the idea that human beings are guileless and bounded, rational, and all that good stuff. We've created this this image of Homo economicus.
Yeah.
And this idea, and it served us quite well, right? Reductive thinking got us really far in life, but it's got us now. We've become a victim of our own success, for lack of a better word. So if you step back and ask ourselves, how long have we been industrialized? How long have we had the modern computer? Yeah. So we've been industrialized for a couple of 100 years, modern computer for 50, 60 years, large corporations for maybe 100 years, AI, LLM, all that fancy stuff, only 10 years. Who said we've got it right?
Yeah.
How can we say we're even close to understanding how to kind of manage this organization? What do we mean by manage, and what do we mean by control? I think in stable markets, when you're the dominant player, you could control your environment, but what you were doing implicitly was you were externalizing things onto other people, to society at large, and not paying the price for it. And I think as we become more and more aware of things like sustainability, human rights, and all that good stuff, we appreciate that there has to be a different way. And I think as we move from more or less the machine age to the systems age, we need to think differently. And in many respects, that's moving from first order to second order cybernetics. But first order cybernetics is that feedback loop, the idea of, the effect doesn't just go out into the ether, it feeds back. And I think, the engineering mindset has got us to this place. So it's great. Yeah. In some respects, the Western mind is a measuring and categorizing mind. And it's really good. It's really helpful, but it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. We now need to focus on feedback and people and unintended and unexpected consequences, and we can't manage our way out of that in the same way. Management is, like I said, it's about creating conditions for success. And I think if we think about the challenges of organizations, we don't have that whole range. I mean, if you think about, if I do a bit of MBA speak, right, there are varieties of capitalism. Capitalism isn't just one thing. So, there's a difference between a liberal market economy like ourselves in the UK and the States, and a more coordinated market economy like, say, Germany. And our approach and the institutional regimes that we have are different, and we get different types of organizations. But we've set up a situation where organizations are becoming increasingly larger. They're becoming these transnational things that effectively globalize and focus on one thing, and it's just about efficiency, for lack of a better word, but without asking questions of effectiveness, without asking questions of, how do we develop people? I mean, if we think about the ludicrousness of what we're doing with AI, and AI is a tool, and it's a fantastic tool when it's understood and used well. But once we automate everything, who's going to consume? Who's going to have enough money to buy anything from these organizations? It doesn't make any sense. So I think it's that shift changing. It's that shift in thinking. I think we are continuing to use a machine, or at best an organism metaphor, when we now need a social systems metaphor. Coming back to Ackoff.
Yeah, awesome. What's that? I want to now dive into the meat of today's podcast, the core topic, which is viable operating model and the ideas that underpin it. So to those that are unfamiliar with your work on viable operating model, can you please explain what it is and what its pillars are? I know you also used the metaphor, the hand that thinks. Maybe we'll get to that later, but if you want to use it in explaining it, that's fine too.
Sure. So the viable operating model, or the operating model idea, has evolved. The aim or the plan was never to invent something, or I'm not even necessarily going to call it an invention. Like I said, I'm interested in kind of connecting with contemporary practice and seeing how we can augment and make that better. And in a very simple sense, managers and operatives alike, they understand the idea of strategy to execution. And for me, the operating model is being between the hard place and the rock, between strategy and operations. And for me, an operating model is anything that connects that, and in a bidirectional way. So what I usually say is, if you're building a shed, it's quite easy, right? It's just a small set of parts that you put together. If you're building a skyscraper, again, it's much more complicated or complex, and we'll talk about what these words mean a bit later. But you wouldn't dare do it without a blueprint. Yet we design organizations, for lack of a better word, with people that are purposeful, with very myopic blueprints. At best, we have an org chart, which is nothing more than a blame chart, because it just tells you who to shout out when something goes wrong. We have a set of financial statements, the balance sheet, cash flow statements, which is nothing much more than creative accounting, for lack of a better word. So the viable operating model kind of organically evolved from trying to connect strategy and operations together. I realized that you can't talk about strategy in isolation. You can't talk about operations in isolation. And this natural model evolved, for lack of a better word. The pillars broadly are Stafford Beer's idea of viable systems model, but other things too, like teams integrity. So Stafford, in the operating model, which is a very structured model of kind of 10 building blocks, brings that regulatory architecture, notwithstanding it's not ontological. And then the other pillar that is essentially Russell Ackoff's idea of human development and purposefulness, and interactive planning. The idea that that organizations are not there to treat people as a means to an end. And then the other two pillars very quickly are, I initially started with kind of Kaufman's idea of autocatalytic sets and constraint closure, the idea of how do we balance the top down and the bottom of an organization. So we speak to strategy folks or agile folks, we come at it from completely different perspectives. And what I'm saying is you're not wrong. You just need something in the middle, what I call middle out architecture, to keep that tension and to keep us honest. So essentially what you end up with a viable operating model is the hand that think is roughly about a 4-way homeostat. It's actually not a homeostat. It's what you call, I think, it's homoretic. It's about a pathway. But the idea is there's a tension between system 3 and system 4, which is grip and reach. So that's kind of a horizontal tension. And there's a tension between the promise and the proof, like your purpose and what you do on a day-to-day basis. So roughly speaking, that is the strategy to execution framework. And most of the times when I'm with a client or in a business, we can use contemporary language and nudge people to think more systemically. We don't necessarily start with a viable system model or any model for that matter. It starts with conversations. So you've got that 4-way tension. Sorry, I got back to Kaufman. So Kaufman was a start, and then I discovered kind of Robert Rosen's work more recently, the idea of anticipatory systems, which works really well with the idea of systems 4 more explicitly. And then last but not least, the idea of a social system. If we think about autopoiesis and Matriona Varela's idea, well, organizations don't produce people, right? Yeah. What they do produce is messages and communication. So Luhmann's ideas helps us to think about the communications communicating. So roughly speaking, the viable operating model is a mediating methodology. What it's saying is organizations have a certain pattern of relationship, which is invariant. And it has certain structural realization, which is plastic. And much of contemporary practice is plastic. It's business process management, IT enterprise architecture. We're interested in the physicality of how this org chart is implemented, how this system is implemented. And that's where we do our analysis. And much of systems practice is focused on the organizing logic, which is about the patterns of relations, which is essentially what the VSM is, right? It's a model about 5 subsystems that occur recursively. But equally, SSM, soft systems methodology, the other systems tools are also about the patterns of relationships. And my thought is these things need to be held in tension. And that's what the viable operating model helps us to do. But it's not enough just to hold these things in tension. We need instruments that allow us to measure what that gap is like. And I have something called the SPS, which basically means Systemic Performance Surface, and it's roughly answering 3 questions that I think any executive, your Silicon Valley executives, should and would be interested in, which is, are we performing as a business? The other question is, are we viable? And last but not least, and this is something that John Beckford reminded me of, is, do we belong? So most performance management systems answer, are we performing? But there is no context to say, are we viable? Yeah, we might be performing, but is that just, from a short-term point of view, are we going to put ourselves out of business? So that's the other part of the viable operating model. It's about understanding, as a mediating methodology, the difference between organizing logic and structural logic, but then having a performance management system that allows these things to be kept in generative tension. So again, if we think about what tensions are, it's the tension between efficiency and effectiveness, or it's the tension between process thinking and systems thinking. And instead of us getting into arguments or quibbles about one's good and one's bad, let's see when is one appropriate or more or less appropriate. So I'm a big believer in, I don't think there are necessarily good and bad or right and wrong ways, but there are certainly better and worse ways of going about improvement. I've gone on for a bit. But I guess the last statement I will make is we're interested in business improvement, and we need to qualify what we mean by improvement. Like, what do we mean by improvement? And improvement, and there's a really interesting statement I came across, which is all improvement requires change, but not all change is improvement. And I think quite often we're interested in change, okay, whether that's me and you in the IT sense, IT change or organizational change. And really we should be interested in improvement. But then we need to qualify what we mean by improvement, whether that means better products and services to meet increasing or changing customer expectations. That's one kind of improvement. Higher quality and other practical combinations, like, higher quality at a low cost, and being innovative. So, like I said, this kind of loops back to our idea of what is an organization. These modern constructs that we've created, they're the places that we work, they're the places that produce our products and services. So when we say improvement, we need to be a bit more practical about improvement. And we also need to ask improvement for whom.
Yes, I think the Churchman quote comes to mind. Improvement, whether in terms of efficiency or effectiveness, always raises questions of an ethical nature. And so who are we talking about? Which perspective? Awesome. I think that's kind of a good overview. You spoke about, multiple influences coming from different people and how it all weaves together as the viable operating model.
Can I add something else, if you don't mind? And we spoke about this briefly. The responsibility that we have to improve organizations comes from cybernetics, second order cybernetics, because the observer is now part of the loop, not separate from the observation. That makes us responsible, and it gives us that moral obligation. I think I remarked on one of your quotes, one of your posts recently around that, and things like raw analysis really helps us to appreciate the subtle difference between responsibility and authority, right? So in our modern organizations, we have someone at the coalface. They're responsible, but they don't necessarily have the authority, or they're doing the work, but they don't necessarily have the expertise. And I think that's the big challenge that we have in the world. If you kind of remember the days of outsourcing, right? The calculus was between those things were kind of broken apart, and we did it like a butcher rather than as a surgeon, because and I think I think we're falling back into that same trap in the world of AI, especially agentic AI. And I think things like raw analysis would really help us to understand that gap between expertise and work and responsibility and accountability and who should be consulted. And it's a much more useful and powerful lens than the typical RASCI or rapid type approach. And this also kind of feeds back into this Kantian deontological idea of accountability and responsibility, because something that I always struggled with this idea of separating responsibility from accountability. Notice I'm saying accountability, not authority. We are both accountable and responsible at the same time. It's I am responsible for something, but accountable to someone or some situation. The point that I wanted to make was, if you think about, and I'm overloading the words model, structural models are the contemporary practice that we all know and love and loathe, right? IT, enterprise architecture, organizational design, performance management, balanced scorecard. And then organizing models are these really cool, amazing systems tools and complexity tools and ideas that we have. And I'm using the words like paradigm and methodology and methods in a loose way, right? We can have a more technical conversation if you want. What I'm saying is they need each other. The practices and the practitioners need each other, and we need to not throw stones at each other. Yeah. We can be critical, but we shouldn't we shouldn't criticize each other. And the reason is, an IT architect is getting on with things as best they can without the theory, without becoming an academic, and they're trying their best. And if we keep throwing stones at them, what they're going to do is make up their theory in a really ad hoc way, right? Equally, the systems thinkers, for lack of a better word, they're getting accused of not being practical or just being a consultant and writing a report and going away, and they're going to make up the implementation as well. So for me, it's really about creating a generative tension and allowing practical people to be practical, but with theory in mind, and allowing academic people or more academically inclined people to help develop the rigor, but whilst doing real stuff. And so for me, I heard this term pracademic recently, and I think that's a really powerful term. We've got to find that middle ground. But of course, find that middle ground is really hard because we live in a very specialized world where we have fixed roles. We're specialists in this and specialists in that. Really long digression, but let's just remind ourselves that human beings are generalists.
Mm-hmm.
We specialize in generalizing, right? We were never meant to just do one thing. And I don't think we can just do one thing.
The Robert Heinlein quote comes to mind. Specialization is for insects. I want to step back and ask the question, what prompted you to go and actually build your own model, the viable operating model? To me, VSM, it's like you briefly mentioned in the previous response, like system 3 and system 4. And it, if you try to explain this to us, to a Silicon Valley executive, it's just going to go over their heads like that. And so I think we need better ways to communicate with these executives. And I find that viable operating model may be one of those things because you speak the business language and you bring this to the actual practical aspects of how we do things. And so I'm kind of curious, like what you found lacking in VSM that you had to go and build VOM.
So the VSM is geometrically wonderful. I was going to say perfect, but nothing's perfect. So my understanding is Stafford Beer developed the VSM from Ashby's work, The Law of Requisite Variety. And the law of the requisite variety is essentially the idea that only variety can absorb variety. And that sounds like a really trivial statement. It's an incredibly powerful statement, but it's only really one half of the story because it only makes sense once you take kind of Conant and Ashby's idea of every good regulator needs to be a model of the system. But actually, it's not the model of the system; it's the model of the interaction between the system. So what Beer did was took those brilliant ideas of starting with the concept of a transformation, changing states and coupling and feedback, and he recognized that you needed a system 4 and you needed a system 5 to connect all of this together. Now, when I tried to use the VSM directly, it was difficult because you start to hunt for boxes and you start to hunt for tools. And that's the power of the VSM. And it's also the downfall of the VSM. Because remember, structural models is where most people think. They think at the physical level. So as an enterprise architect, we often talk about being conceptual, logical, and physical. Well, actually, there are 3 very different ways of thinking. And so for me, very practically, conceptual thinking is about capabilities, what you must do as a business, but without, not worrying too much about the details. And logical is about how you do things, your value streams, the order and sequence. And the physical is the kind of why you do things, your products. So what do you do? How do you do it? And why do you do it? And they kind of naturally align with physical, logical, conceptual, and they naturally bring together what you do, how you do it, and why you do it. So techniques and approaches like that resonate with managers and executives. The other thing to bear in mind is executives need useful tools to help them answer the questions that they need to answer. But I think once you start to explain or realize that, again, John Beckford's kind of quote, it's not about coming up with quick answers, it's about coming up with better questions. So what we've got to really do is help managers and executives come up with better questions, especially as the world changes. And that's a very different type of thinking. It's more what you call right to left thinking rather than left to right thinking. And left to right thinking is, you're always looking for a solution, for lack of a better word, to a nail looking hammers and nails as it goes. And even systems thinkers suffer from that. And right to left thinking is the exact opposite. It's about breaking the symmetry. It's about dissolving the problem, which takes us back to Ackoff's idea, right? Ackoff said the best way to solve a problem is to dissolve it.
And
to
even
change the
Beer
situation. So it's a very different way of thinking. So if you think about the Bible operating model, the reason I use the analogy of the hand that thinks is, if you think about your fingers, each of your fingers is like an S1. It's doing something in the world. That's the reason your business exists. So if you think about your 5 fingers and think of those as being system ones, well, those system ones operate in the world, and they may not knock into each other. They may or may not provide resistance depending on whether they have shared markets, shared customers, shared data, etc. And those fingers need a certain level of coordination. Okay, and that's what S2 is. But S2 isn't just about coordination; it's also about healthy competition. I'll share another story if you don't mind, which is a manager in an organization went to my boss, my manager at the time, and said, "The problem with Abdul is he's a socialist and I'm a capitalist." And this is a product manager, and I said, "Well, if by socialist he means that Abdul wants to create platforms, not just technical platforms, but business platforms that allow product managers and owners to play and succeed and fail, then yeah, that's what I'm about." So it's this idea of coordination and competition. So that metaphor works. And then the idea of system 3 is really about your grip. You hold something too tight and you break it, and if you don't hold it just right. But then that's essentially in management speak what we talk about. That's exploitation, right? You're exploiting a certain market and environment. So if you think about us as being nomads, the nomadic life we had, it's about not exploiting a place too much. It's about moving forward. And then system 4 then becomes about the reach, if you think about it, where you want to go to next. And then system 5 is really about the identity. So if you think about the hand that thinks metaphor, it's really about how, what is your grip on the here and now? Where might you be going? And it's about anticipating what that future might be. So one of the really powerful things that I really enjoy about Robert Rolson's idea is that we don't just we create a model of the future and run it slightly ahead of real time to anticipate what may happen, and we feed that into the calculus, which is so it's not a determined push. You're almost creating the future, for lack of a better word. So I really like that idea. So the hand that thinks provides managers, day-to-day people, whether that's in the software part of the business or the actual operations part of the business, to kind of really think about how these different things like strategy and architecture and data and technology come together. So a few moments ago, I described capability, value stream, and product. What, how, and why. Well, if you imagine at the top of that, you've got people. People are the ones that are making any of these distinctions. And then more practically, you can then think about our 2 favorite subjects, data and technology. Well, it's not just about technology. It's about data and technology, and not just data, but insight and information and all that good stuff. We can now start to think about, well, what's the role of data and technology from a capability point of view? How does data and technology enable our processes? How do we integrate data and technology better? How do we embed data and technology into the product itself? Because the new world is a cyber-physical world. The old world, remember, even though it was the machine age, and now we're in the systems age, in a funny way, the systems age also includes the machine, right? So we live in a cyber-physical world. And these things resonate with people because they're helpful. I can start to think about an initiative, whether that's something that we do in a waterfall type way or in a more agile way, and hang our hats on things without getting too fussed about the language. And the language kind of evolves and emerges over time.
Awesome. Well said. You also mentioned something called the fantasy gap. If I remember correctly, it's the disconnect between what an organization promises to be and what its structure actually proves it does. So why do traditional frameworks failed so spectacularly at closing this gap? And how does the viable operating model kind of force their organizations to face their structural reality?
It's positive, right? The purpose of a system is what it does.